The suitcase hit the driveway before anyone noticed the little boy crying. 12-year-old Callum Hart stood beside his father with both hands wrapped around a worn blue backpack, watching as his grandmother locked the front door behind them. His father, Everett Hart, had spent 6 years sacrificing everything to keep his family together, and now, with nowhere to sleep and only a few dollars in his pocket, he had been thrown out of the house he had helped build. What his family did not know was that by the following morning, Everett would wake up in a $30 million mansion bearing his name, and the people who had humiliated him would discover that the quiet man they thought was struggling to survive had been hiding a truth powerful enough to change every life around him. Before we begin this emotional journey, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue sharing stories that remind us that appearances never tell the whole story. Everett had never been the kind of man who needed to prove himself. At 38, he was a gentle, hard-working father who measured success by whether Callum had eaten breakfast, whether his son had clean clothes for school, and whether there was enough money left at the end of the week to buy the sketchbooks Callum loved. Since his wife, Maren, had passed away after a long illness, Everett had carried the weight of parenthood alone. He had become father, mother, cook, driver, tutor, nurse, and protector, often working until his hands ached while pretending he was never tired. His wife's family had initially promised to stand beside him, but grief had slowly turned their sympathy into resentment. Everett's mother-in-law, Beatrice, believed he had failed to provide the kind of wealthy life her daughter deserved. His brother-in-law, Conrad, constantly reminded him that Maren had come from a respectable family while Everett had grown up with almost nothing. Everett never answered their insults. He simply lowered his eyes, took Callum's hand, and reminded himself that his son did not need to hear hatred from the people he still called family. The truth was that Everett was not poor. He had simply chosen to live as though he were. Years earlier, before Maren became sick, Everett had quietly created a technology company with a friend named Graham Mercer. Everett had designed the original software architecture, written much of the early code himself, and invested nearly every dollar he possessed. When the company exploded into an international success, Everett became extraordinarily wealthy almost overnight. But instead of buying sports cars or appearing in magazines, he placed most of his wealth into private trusts and investments. He wanted Callum to grow up believing that character mattered more than money. He had seen too many people become cruel after discovering someone was wealthy, and he feared his son would learn the wrong lesson from privilege. When Maren became ill, Everett used his fortune to pay for the best care available, but he kept the details private because Maren had always hated the idea of money changing how people treated them. After Maren's death, Everett returned to the modest family home where Beatrice lived with Conrad. He believed staying there temporarily would help Callum remain close to his mother's relatives. Instead, every day became another test of patience. Beatrice complained that Everett contributed too little, even though he paid for groceries, school expenses, utilities, and medical bills. Conrad mocked Everett's old clothes and battered car, unaware that Everett deliberately drove an ordinary vehicle because he did not want Callum growing up surrounded by unnecessary luxury. Then one afternoon, everything finally broke. Beatrice accused Everett of taking advantage of her family and declared that he and Callum could no longer remain under her roof. Conrad carried Everett's suitcase outside and placed it beside the driveway while Callum stood frozen, unable to understand how adults who had once hugged him could suddenly look at his father as though he were a burden. Everett did not fight. He did not threaten them. He did not reveal his wealth. He simply bent down, picked up Callum's backpack, wiped the tears from his son's face, and walked away with him beneath the bright afternoon sun. They spent the remaining hours sitting at a small cafe near the bus station while Everett tried to find temporary accommodation. Callum kept asking where they would go, and every time, Everett smiled gently and promised that everything would be all right. Inside, however, his heart was breaking. Not because of the house, the money, or the humiliation, but because his son had just learned that sometimes the people who share your blood can still make you feel unwanted. While they sat together, Everett received a call from his longtime attorney, Celeste Rowan. She had been trying to reach him for weeks because a major legal matter involving his family trust had finally been completed. The $30 million estate Everett had purchased years earlier had been renovated and was now ready for occupancy. Everett had postponed moving into it because he had been waiting until Callum was emotionally ready to leave the old house behind. Now, after what had happened, there was no reason to delay. Celeste reminded him that the property included a private library, gardens, a guest cottage, a studio for Callum's artwork, and enough space for Everett to finally build the peaceful home he had always wanted for his son. Everett listened quietly before looking across the table at Callum, who was drawing a small house on a paper napkin. For the first time that day, Everett smiled. The next morning, a convoy of elegant vehicles arrived outside the $30 million estate known as Betrayal House. The property stood on several acres of carefully landscaped land, with tall windows reflecting the morning sunlight, stone terraces overlooking gardens, and a long driveway lined with flowering trees. Everett did not arrive wearing an expensive suit. He stepped from an ordinary car wearing the same simple jacket he had worn the previous day. Callum climbed out beside him, staring at the mansion with disbelief. Everett placed a hand on his son's shoulder and told him that this was not a reward for being rejected. It was simply a home that had always belonged to them. Callum walked through the front doors and stopped in silence when he saw a bright art studio prepared with canvases, pencils, paints, and shelves filled with books. Everett had remembered every little dream his son had ever mentioned. But Everett's greatest surprise was not the mansion. It was what he decided to do with it. Instead of using his wealth to punish Beatrice and Conrad, he planned to use the estate as the foundation of a charitable organization in Marin's memory. He wanted to create scholarships for children who had lost parents, support single parents struggling to survive, and provide temporary housing for families facing sudden homelessness. Everett understood something that his family had not. Wealth could buy walls, but it could not create a home. A home was created by the way people treated each other inside those walls. News of Everett's fortune eventually reached Beatrice through a former business associate who recognized his name. She discovered that the quiet son-in-law she had thrown out was the founder and majority owner of one of the most valuable technology firms in the country. She learned that his investments were worth hundreds of millions and that Betrayal House alone had cost $30 million. Conrad refused to believe it until he saw the photographs and financial records. The realization devastated them, not because Everett had become rich, but because they understood how cruel they had been to a man who had never once used his wealth to make them feel small. Beatrice went to Betrayal House that afternoon, but she did not walk through the front door with the confidence she once carried. She stood at the entrance for several minutes, holding a small box containing Marin's childhood photographs. Everett found her there and immediately understood why she had come. She expected anger. She expected humiliation. She expected Everett to remind her that she had thrown him and her grandson onto the street. Instead, Everett invited her inside. The meeting was painful. Beatrice finally admitted that grief had turned into bitterness. She had spent years blaming Everett for Marin's death because blaming someone felt easier than accepting that there had been nothing anyone could do. She had convinced herself that Everett was not good enough for her daughter because she needed someone to blame for the life she had lost. Conrad eventually arrived and admitted that jealousy had influenced his behavior. He had watched Everett succeed quietly and assumed that Everett's silence meant weakness. Together, they stood before the man they had rejected and finally saw him clearly. Everett forgave them, but forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing had happened. He told them that Callum needed family members who would make him feel loved, not people who would make him feel ashamed of his father. Beatrice cried as she admitted that she had nearly lost her grandson because she had allowed pride to become more important than love. Conrad apologized without excuses. Everett accepted their apologies, but he also established boundaries. From that day forward, respect would be the price of remaining close to Callum. Months passed, and Betrayal House became something far more meaningful than a mansion. Children who had lost parents visited its gardens through Everett's foundation. Single fathers and mothers received financial assistance. Scholarships were created in Marin's name. Callum's art studio became a place where children could paint, draw, and express emotions they could not explain with words. Everett continued living simply. He still drove an ordinary car. He still made breakfast for his son. He still checked Callum's homework and attended every school event he could. The mansion had changed their address, but it had not changed the man. One afternoon, Callum stood beside his father beneath a tree in the garden and looked toward the house. He remembered the driveway where his suitcase had been thrown out and compared it with the peaceful home standing before him. He finally understood that his father's greatest victory had never been the $30 million mansion. It had been refusing to become bitter after being treated badly. Everett had possessed the power to destroy the people who had hurt him, but he chose something harder. He chose forgiveness without surrendering his dignity, success without arrogance, and wealth without allowing it to define him. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before we reach the final moment, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Everett's greatest victory was: becoming wealthy, forgiving his family, or protecting his son's heart. Your words may remind someone in our community that rejection is not always the end of the story. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the gardens, Everett watched Callum laugh with a group of children painting beneath the trees. He thought about the suitcase sitting on that driveway months earlier and realized that the moment he had believed was his lowest point had actually been the doorway to a new life. His family had thrown him out because they believed he had nothing. The truth was that he had everything that truly mattered: a son who loved him, a heart that had survived grief, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to understand that money was only valuable when it could be used to make someone else's life better. Belmere House was worth $30 million, but the life Everett built inside it was worth far more. And from that day forward, every person who entered those gates learned the same lesson Everett had learned the hard way: sometimes the people who reject you are unknowingly pushing you toward the life you were always meant to live.